We no longer have the time to explain climate change is real, and we no longer have the time to explain why we have to change. What we need is to know what to do and how to do it. Just to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming requires a 7% per year downshift of emissions, fossil fuel extraction, and fossil fuel use. We have also to remember that 1.5 is not a target, it is a safety limit. As a short-term goal, we have to halve emissions by 2030, and by the time of this video, we only have 7 years left. I know it sounds daunting, if not outright impossible. And this is where transition engineering comes in, to show that it is very much so possible, where we use new ways, new tools, new methods to tackle and solve those big wicked problems. Now, the first rule of engineering is know the problem that you are working on. So today, I am going to present you a study conducted by 3 transition engineers where we look at the very wicked problem of nitrogen fertilizer use in the agricultural system of Germany. We fully assess the system, the problem, and we envisage multiple scenarios to see which ones actually lead us towards a safer, more sustainable future. Know that this video is but a summary, so some details are going to be omitted. However, the study is published in the journal Sustainability and is free access. So with the link in the description of the video, you can have access to all the details.
The first tool is the wicked problem definition. We have to look at what we're up against. A wicked problem is always centered around an essential activity, because after all, downshifting a non-essential activity is easy. You just stop doing it. It will only hurt egos, not lives. Here, we work with the very essential need of accessing nutrition. Without agriculture, we die, and we have to acknowledge that the current system simply works great. We use artificial nitrogen fertilizers, it is legal, health and safety compliant, and profitable. However, we know it is not sustainable, as the resources to make those fertilizers are finite, and we can only go so long before totally disrupting the biosphere on which agriculture depends. We know that needs are currently met. Most Germans have a full stomach, and Germany even exports. But it is not without causing harms. Greenhouse gas emissions, eutrophication, biodiversity loss, fossil fuel and energy dependence, and more. So the system must desperately change, and yet it cannot. There are many reasons why change is difficult. Farming in Europe is heavily subsidized and has production incentives. How can you invest to change when billions of euros are locked in infrastructure and debt? Half of the loans are for working capital purposes only. That is just everyday expenses. The liability to asset ratio is around 30%, and total outstanding loans amount to 52 billion euros. How can you change your practices when 40% of revenues come from animal output? How can you think about changing when wages are low and suicide rates alarmingly high? It cannot change because the system just works. We see the vicious cycle paralyzing us, and most tend to focus on only one aspect. We need a broader vision to address this. And comes in the InTIME method for interdisciplinary transition, innovation, management, and engineering. A sequential method allowing to tame wicked problems, and it all starts with history. You can find the details in the study, but in short, even past methods were not necessarily sustainable. Agriculture simply organically evolved, inefficiently at first, towards the well-engineered system of today. We currently have the highest yield for less land ever, all thanks to the Haber-Bosch process, combining hydrogen and nitrogen to make ammonia while emitting CO2. However, this system is still wasteful. with over-fertilization, poor diets, overeating, and food waste. Where does that bring us now? Germany uses around 2.7 million tons of nitrogen as fertilizer. Roughly half comes from artificial source, and the other half from animal manure. Plants are rather inefficient at using nitrogen, so 40% just leaches away or volatilizes as nitrous oxide, a greenhouse gas that is 300 times more potent than CO2. At present, Germany's agricultural sector emits 60 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year. That is 8% of its national emissions. Looking at agricultural emissions as a whole, we see that most comes from animal enteric fermentation, their guts. Only 8% are from nitrogen fertilizer synthesis directly. When we look at agricultural land, we see that it covers half of the country, of which we can roughly say that half is dedicated to animals and the other part to crops. You can see that the portion of land occupied by respective animals and crops is mostly for pigs, cows, and cereals. It is worth noting that Germany is mostly self-sufficient in animal products, potatoes, and cereals. Speaking of, only 20% of cereal production is for humans and 57% for animals. Now, what can the future be like? Let us look at different scenarios. Remember, a scenario is just a model, not a prediction. We have options: a change in technology, practice, or behavior. Let's test them. In all scenarios, nutrition production is constant. That is fat, protein, and carbohydrates. We must verify if the different scenarios allow to mitigate all of the harms that we mentioned earlier. First, what if we don't change our practices, but all the fertilizers are made from green hydrogen? To meet current demand, Germany would need an additional 27 terawatt-hour of electricity every year to power 3 gigawatt of electrolyzers. And since electricity has to be supplied continuously, we assume a mix of offshore wind, 6 gigawatt, with on-land storage to provide up to 3.5 days of electricity. What happens? We see that Germany no longer uses fossil fuels, which is great. However, it requires more than twice as much energy due to efficiency losses. Eutrophication and biodiversity loss are unchanged, and surprisingly, emissions increased. That is because of the carbon embedded in this whole new system that requires a lot more energy to run. Remember, only 8% of current agricultural emissions are directly related to ammonia synthesis. This scenario does not achieve anything except fossil fuel independence. From a climate perspective, it is objectively a costly distraction. Fine. What if all the current food output was produced organically then? No more artificial fertilizers, just manure. We can determine how much land is required to provide the same output for different crops. We see no more fossil fuel use to fertilize, no energy actually. But Germany needs to cut all its forest area to grow the same amount of food. Emissions would decrease by a third, but one could argue that if we included emissions related to deforestation, it would not be the case. Even if eutrophication goes down 70%, this scenario isn't good. Okay, what if all Germans became vegan? No more animal products, but no more manure. To produce the same amount of nutrients, Germany would have to compensate manure loss by producing more ammonia. 70% more than today, actually. The country would use 30% less land, emit 60% less, but would still have a eutrophication problem. None of those scenarios are compatible with our climate goals, nor are sustainable. We must think differently. We need a combination of scenarios. One scenario works. Have 75% less animals, which would save enough land and grow the rest organically. Germany would be independent of fossil fuels, need no additional land, emissions would go down 80%, and eutrophication is virtually inexistent. This is what needs to be done. Now that we see what the future must be like, let us focus on how to reach that goal with shift projects. A shift project is readily implementable and can act on 3 levers: policy, industry, or the public. Note that I did not say consumer because we are more than that. Our study suggests many options, and some are consistent with current European goals, such as the Fit for 55 strategy with stringent limits on nitrogen use, organic farming targets, or even countries like the Netherlands or Ireland deciding to pay farmers to reduce livestock. One key aspect that needs addressing is the tight leash of debt. Farmers are struggling, and nothing significant will happen unless we undo that burden. We highly recommend grants and debt relief measures on the counterpart that farmers change practice. We now see that the wicked problem of agriculture is a little bit more tame. We know what the future must be like. Let us avoid distractions. Energy, resources, money, manpower, these are zero-sum games. If they are used for nonsense, they won't be used for what needs doing. The InTIME method allows to evaluate clear paths and reminds us that the transition is not impossible. It is necessary.